which grows beautiful under one's own hands is truly a pleasure. And what more so than the making of a piecework quilt? Glad memories are woven unaware in blending pieces of each favorite dress. And so the quilt is eloquent today with happiness that passes not away.
Western Kentucky University, through a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, presents Kentucky Heritage, the story of crafts and traditions passed on from generation to generation. Of the Kentucky Long Rifle, a handmade reproduction of a proud gunsmith. Of the traditional hand tools, such as the broadaxe used by the pioneers to hew and shape logs. And of the handmade piecework quilt, a labor of love by young and old. Traditional quilting in Kentucky. Here to tell us the quilting story is Helen Crocker.
The tradition of piecework quilting extends far back into Kentucky history and continues unbroken today. There's an element of revival in modern attitudes toward this old-fashioned work. Renewed interest has sprung up, and as a result, many want to try their hand at quilt making, or if not that, to at least own a handmade quilt. There are too few authentic quilt makers left for us to enjoy today, but fortunately, Kentucky quilt makers have traditionally passed on their knowledge and skill from generation to generation. The expressions of individuality continue to please the many admirers of good quilting. Just what has caused this renewed interest in the handmade quilt? Could it be that modern woman wants to own something that's not only functional, but also satisfying and rich with association? Let's look into the art of quilt making for some answers. First, quilt is a very old word, tracing back through Old French to Latin, and ultimately probably to Sanskrit. Quilt basically means a cloth sandwich, so to speak. Layers of cloth with a filler in between, tied or stitched to keep the filler from balling up. We have many examples of quilted things. Quilted padding that knights wore under their armor, or quilted mattress covers, or quilted sleeping bags, quilted skirts, and quilted liners of clothing, just to name a few. We also know that in cold parts of China, a variety of quilted clothing is common. In one of Shakespeare's plays, Falstaff is called a quilt in a playful reference to his overstuffed appearance. The salvage art of sewing small pieces together to make larger pieces seems a natural thing to do. How long ago did this begin? One researcher has pointed out that drawings and paintings show that even the ancient Egyptians used pieces of cloth sewn together for clothing. We can assume then that piecing or patching salvage cloth, along with quilting, came together long ago in the form of useful bed covers. But it's also important to note that an artistic expression accompanied the quilting tradition. For example, this beautiful handmade quilt could be found in any home where traditional furnishings are valued. Its design is one of the best known, the double wedding ring. There was a time when a girl about to be married expected to have her hope chest filled with piecework or applique quilts. I remember an old poem from days gone by which went something like this. At your quilting maids, don't dally. Quilt quick if you would marry. A maid who's quiltless at 21 never shall greet her bridal son. And so, the quilt held its place of importance in the young person's life as well as the old. There are two basic steps in the making of a piecework quilt. First, thousands of tiny, colorful pieces are stitched together to make the quilt top. Then the quilt top is joined to the filler and the backing to make the finished quilt. The making of a piecework quilt like this requires many hours of tedious, exacting labor with scissors, needle, and thread. Here's how it all begins. In this example, the original puzzle was taken from an old wooden puzzle. The marking pattern was cut from pieces of thin cardboard in the shape of a triangle, a square, and a diamond. These were carefully laid on the material, and the pieces were cut out. Next, they were sewn together to make the block in the exact form of the original puzzle. The blocks are stitched together in rows, or strings as quilt makers call them. And in the last step, the strings are joined together to make the completed quilt top. From here, the quilt top is placed on the quilting frame, where it is joined with the filler and the backing. And finally, the edges are finished with bias strips. Later in the show, you will see a quilting frame in actual use. This puzzle quilt, like many others, is an elaborately improvised piecework quilt. You might wonder, just as I have, what motivates a housewife to undertake such a project? Is it utility, or frugality, or artistic satisfaction? First, let's consider utility. This is Myra Bumpus of Bowling Green. Myra, could you tell us how you use all these quilts that you make?
Well, the first quilts I quilted for myself before I married to use on the bed. After I married, just for warmth. And a lot of them I fix like to give for gifts, maybe at a wedding shower or something. You give someone a real pretty quilt to use, or quilt them to sell to people that can't quilt or don't know how and would like to buy them, or maybe quilt them for a bedspread to use to decorate a room to match the color or something like that.
What is this pattern that you're making now?
This is the Dresden plate. It'll be used on an applique quilt. Fasten it down the raw edges like I'm doing now and applique it to a white, possibly a white sheet or a piece of bleached domestic, and used as a bedspread.
What do you intend to do with it when you're finished?
Well, I might sell it, and with all the time and trouble I'm putting in it, I might keep it.
Do you have a set price for a quilt like that?
Well, one like this would run pretty high, I guess, because there's a lot of finger work on it, there's a lot of time put in on it. But one that you would do maybe piece of pieces on the sewing machine or something like that, where it doesn't take as much time, or a simple pattern, you'd sell quite a bit cheaper.
Do you do an applique quilt like this on the quilting frame?
Well, you would have to quilt it on a quilting frame. You can applique the pieces to the white material on a sewing machine, or you can do it on your fingers either way. I guess most likely quilting hook would be the best place to applique these to the piece of material.
We'll talk to you about that some more later. Now I wonder if you could explain to us why you choose one pattern over another.
Well, if I have quite a bit of material in large pieces, I'd pick a larger design so I don't waste as much of the material, and use the smaller pieces that's left over then for a real small design. And usually just start out using the larger pieces with the large design, and then go on down and use it to the next design that would take the next pieces and use the most of the material on down to the smallest ones. According to our guest, she's partly governed in her choice of pattern by utility or practical considerations, what she has on hand or what she has left over from other sewing projects. But while she thinks of quilts as useful, a look at her work tells us that her appreciation goes far beyond keeping warm. She's very artistic as she works with her material. Notice how the creative urge seems to blend in closely with utility and frugality. It's sometimes difficult to separate the three. This will become more obvious throughout the program as we look at other quilts. Here is what is sometimes known as a crazy quilt or a patchwork quilt. This kind, though still popular, reaches far back to the origins of the craft. It is unique because of the more or less random piecing together of scraps or salvage
to make a piece large enough to be useful. This type of quilt, utilizing scraps of fine satin, silk, or velvet, found its way into some old-time parlors and sitting rooms as throws for settee or couch. Every patchwork quilt has its own life story. Here is a particularly interesting one, as told by Mrs. Virginia Pearson of Bowling Green.
This is a beautiful example of a patchwork quilt and is in remarkable state of preservation. It's almost 100 years old, but because the pieces are made almost entirely from wool challis, it has lasted well. Each piece in the quilt is different from the other, and they are put together with a feather stitch, many variations of the feather stitch. You can see several examples of that here. There are some that look like clover, some like bird's feet, and some like small leaves. Then in each piece is an embroidered representation of something that Mrs. Miller saw about her here in rural Kentucky. In this piece we have a pansy, which is in an outline stitch, and in this piece we have a cherry tree, which is developed in crewel embroidery. And over here there is an owl, which is outline stitch again and in great detail. And then here we have a rabbit, which is embroidered in many colors. It too is in an outline stitch. And then in the center of the quilt is a horse, which is made of velveteen. This horse belonged to Mrs. Miller's husband. The horse's name was Chester Dare, and we're told that hair from the tail of this horse was sent to New Orleans in order that a perfect match for color could be obtained in the material that would be used for the horse. As is in the case of most patchwork quilts, the maker leaves her name on the quilt somewhere. And here we have Mrs. Miller's name on this piece. And since Mrs. Miller lived to be only 26 years old, we see depicted here most of her life on the pieces of this quilt.
Modern Kentucky quilters still make old-fashioned comforts of heavy woolens and crazy patch all-over designs, but they more often use cotton fabrics for string quilts. These scraps of material are sewn together onto a paper backing into the size and shape wanted, usually a square. The fabrics are then trimmed, and the paper backing is torn away. Here is a finished string quilt called the spiderweb. Most quilts use the basic one-patch design. No folds would be made in the starting piece of material. The entire quilt could be pieced whole without forming individual blocks. This around-the-world design is a one-patch which very clearly demonstrates this. Going a step further, if we take a square of material and fold it diagonally, we get a two-patch block. A very simple pattern would result from alternating contrasting triangles in each block. Most quilters make their pattern even more complicated, as in this flower basket design. Among the most popular basic patterns are the 4-patch and the 9-patch. The 4-patch is made by first dividing a square of material into 4 patches. You could then subdivide it into smaller parts, as long as the pieces continue to make the same size squares or blocks. This windmill is a simple type of 4-patch. Jacob's ladder, a more complicated 4-patch design, is a popular pattern with Kentucky quilters. 42 of these blocks are sewn together. In an individual block, we see 12 pieces, small squares and half squares, which the maker sewed together in alternate colors to make the design stand out. Alternating pieces give enough contrast to form a pattern in a block, so arranging the blocks to fit together properly gives the overall patterned effect. We see this in this example known as the snake trail. This pattern, like the double wedding ring, makes use of many small pieces set together with larger pieces of contrasting solid color. The very popular 9-patch is the quilt top little girls of 8 or 9 used to do as their first piece top. It can be almost infinitely varied. If the maker wishes to divide some of the 9 pieces into smaller pieces, many creative designs can be accomplished. One of the basic patterns is the Irish chain, which consists of chain squares. This quilt sometimes is called Road to California and is of the Irish chain family. By now you've noticed that many quilt patterns have names which have been passed down from generation to generation. Here to tell us about it is Joanne Schickel of Western Kentucky University's Department of Home Economics.
The cultural heritage of a quilter is often reflected in her choice of design and pattern name. By tradition, Kentucky quilters make a great distinction between the log cabin pattern and sunshine and shade. Both patterns are made from the same basic plan of stripping together narrow rectangles of various colored fabric around a small central square to form a quilt block. Other quilters, however, have a different conception of the tulip pattern. Some prefer the piece design. Others prefer to applique a tulip to a quilted backing. There's something very personal and individual about a woman's choice of favorite design. Some women prefer to use a bold color combination, such as this one, of red, lavender, green, and blues. Other women prefer to use a great deal of light colored fabric in each quilt. One woman has made a number of red, white, and blue quilts, her tribute to a husband and 6 sons who fought in American wars. The persistence of certain design motifs, such as stars, flowers, fans, and circles, indicates the patchwork media rather than the Kentucky region. Is this friendship knot or starry crown? By now you've guessed that many quilters have given the same names to different quilt patterns. Is this Solomon's Puzzle, or Wonder of the World, or merely a slight variation of Drunkard's Path, or Robbing Peter to Pay Paul? It's no wonder the pioneers gave biblical names to so many of their quilts, since religion played such an important part in their everyday lives. Kentucky quilts have symbolic meaning also. One quilter in Morgantown, Kentucky, named this general design, I Wish You Well. A related design is called churn dasher. This is a churn dasher, an object well known in every rural Kentucky household. Note the resemblance between the cross pieces of wood at the end of the dasher and the crooked cross in the quilt square. We know this design as a swastika, one of the oldest known in art. It is a sign for good luck and prosperity. Despite the negative connotations given this design in recent history, its ancient meaning persists in the quilt, I Wish You Well. I've shown you just a few of the variety of quilts that are made in Kentucky. There's no limitation to the choice of design or pattern. All the quilt patterns that we have shown you today are currently known and used by Kentucky quilters, though some are quite common and others are rare.
Just how much of this is creative art and how much is simply copying certain designs over and over again? Traditional formulas govern the basic patterns, and these formulas in turn are governed by the availability of the materials and limitations of the technique. With that in mind, we can state in principle, in many primitive and folk arts, the limitations of materials and tools impose certain limitations on design. All this does not mean that it is impossible to make quilts with pictorial art on them. One can cut out any shape and sew it to a backing, as we see in this fine example of applique quilting. It has possibilities of novelty, personalization, and pictorial art. Once again, let's refer back to those 3 motivations: utility, frugality, and art. The utility we are well aware of. Let's talk about frugality a little more. We've already spoken of piecing in terms of salvaging odds and ends, scraps of leftover material from dressmaking and other kinds of sewing. Remember, the people in a pioneer or frontier setting did not have ready access to cloth. To waste it, even small scraps, was something of a sin. Perhaps this is why quilting, though an art older than the United States, took on new life and became something of a domestic and social institution on this side of the Atlantic. In fact, the quilting bee ranked with barn raising and log rolling as a social event. Now you might wonder, how How was the art transmitted through the years? And how were the patterns passed along? Both tended to be on a person-to-person basis, mother to daughter and neighbor to neighbor. One learned piecework ordinarily from a relative or friend, not from a book. For a modern-day example of handing down the art, let's visit with Mrs. Arizona Martin, a resident of Bowling Green, Kentucky.
Mrs. Martin is at the quilting frame with her granddaughter, Myra, and Myra's daughter, Sandra Jean. Mrs. Martin's daughter, Pat, who could not be with us today, makes 4 generations of quilt makers in one family. Mrs. Martin, how did you get started quilting?
I started quilting by my mother working, and I cried and begged her to let me piece a quilt, and she cut me a pattern, and I just went to cutting my pieces and pieced a 9-patch quilt first. And as I grew older, well, she furnished the material, and I helped quilt my quilt. And then after I got married, I used my quilt and wore it out. And I'm 78 years old, and I've been working in the quilt business all this while.
What is the reach on this quilting frame?
About 8 or 10 inches reach, so that it would, you can make your stitches better, you can see how you're sewing, and a long reach, you couldn't make stitches.
Show us about how far that would be.
Just about 10 inches.
From the edge in, about 10 inches.
Yes, ma'am.
How is this put together? Would you show us the lining and the padding?
Yes, ma'am. I have my lining, and then I put my cotton in, and then I put my top over, and we pin it in all together, and then put it in the frames, and then we go to quilt it.
When you were a younger woman, where did you get your cotton?
I raised my cotton myself, and after I sold, moved to Bowling Green, you see, I just threw my old cotton away. I had lots of old cotton, and it was be something to show now. And I had my cards. I picked my cotton. My husband made me a little cotton chin and chin my seed out, and then I'd take my cards and bat my cotton and have it ready to inlay like this between the lining and the cotton. And it quilted so much easier. The quilts are so much fluffier and all.
When you stitch, do you follow a pattern?
Well, I just, if a piece by the quilt by the piece, I follow that, and if not, I won't make pattern, just make up anything I want to and quilt it.
Try to make it pretty.
Try to make it pretty. By diamonds or squares or just any way we want to, bias lines or straight lines, and fix it that way.
Myra, could you tell us another way to do this besides using the quilting frame?
Yes, ma'am. We use what's called a quilting hook, and it's you put your quilt together like you do in the frames, and you transfer it to this hook, and you quilt the space inside, and you move the hook to a different part of the quilt, and go ahead and quilt that and move it over until you get the quilt completely done.
It takes more time to move so often.
Yes, it takes quite a bit more time to do it in the quilting hooks, but if it's one person, it's a whole lot easier. You can hold this in your lap, and if you don't have a whole lot of room, this is the easiest way to do it too, because you can't set quilting frames up just anywhere. You have to have enough room, and this way it's a lot easier for one person anyway.
How do you get all of these different kinds of materials for your quilt?
Well, I sew for myself and for my daughter, and I save the material that's left over, and my family sews, a lot of my family sew, and they save the leftover material. Then we buy material from the Derby Underwear Company, and it's you buy most of our solid colors that we use to set them together and everything with comes from the Derby.
Does this blue in the
Yes.
pattern come from that company?
Yes, you buy it by the bundle, and it's 5 pounds of material is $1, and you get different designs, and you can get printed fabrics as well as solids, and we use a lot of that. We buy a lot of it.
This is far less expensive than buying material.
Oh
in the store.
yes, you get I'd say 20 yards of material in a bundle, and that's $1, and 20 yards of material uptown is quite expensive.
Most quilters do make use of readily available material. For a very striking example of frugality, look at this rather plain design. Its maker calls it a brick quilt. The pieces are that size and shape because a 5-cent sack of tobacco is that size and shape. When empty, it's a potentially useful quilt piece. If the children don't get it for marbles, or if grandmother doesn't get it for buttons, the quilt maker can rip out the seams and accumulate enough pieces to sew into a quilt top. How is that for frugality? Now, let's consider the last motive, art. It is in our time the prime motive, for even in the most frugal households, the artistic element of quilt making is not overlooked. The people who can't go all the way and make the quilts can own them, and with the ownership comes association with a rich legacy of artistic craftsmanship. There is a revival in the art of quilting. As we've tried to show during our program, the one great secret of quilting, which charms from generation to generation, is the pleasure gained from the piecing and the quilting. It's a story of patience and skill, housewifely pride, woman's love for pretty things, and of fingers trained to do such work. We are both beneficiaries and victims of what we like to call progress. Probably no one would actually turn the clock back if he had to take all the consequences, yet the clatter of the machine and the quality-controlled uniformity of mass products are about as poetic as a telephone book, while the unique quilting of an individual artist speaks to us like the language of poetry.
Life is like a piecework quilt, and each little piece is a day. Some pieces are rosy, happy, and bright, and some are dark and gray. But each little piece sits fitted in and sewn to keep it together, makes a finished block in this life of ours, filled with sun and with rainy weather. So let me work on life's piecework quilt through the rainy days and the sun, trusting that when I have finished my block, the master may say, "Well done."
This program was produced by Western Kentucky University through a grant supplied by the National Endowment for the Humanities.